Blow. 3 Little Pigs Retold. A tale in the romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Midsummer festival fever had caught them all in her heathen coils. The higher-born boys fought with practice swords in the yard, their bouts descending into pitched battle with no guard or master-at-arms to break it up. Rudolf found himself stunned in the dust, unnoticed by the others as they pursued longer-held grudges against boys they knew, and he scrambled to his feet. Retreating from the yard seemed the most chivalrous thing to do, for he had more training than most of them, though not enough to stop the fight like his cousin Rudolf might have. Outside the walls, pine had been piled up for the bonfires, huge as haystacks, that would be set alight after dark to feed some ancient beastly god. Now, the fresh, life-giving scent of the pine lay sharp over the bed of long-dead peat from the bogs, reminding him of the inevitability of death, even in the bright summer sun. His thick furs itched in the unaccustomed heat that was so little like home, but he did not dare take them off. They marked him for what he was, a Viking prince among these islanders, who wore linen and leather that was surely more suitable for summer. Peat smoke spiraled in a dark prayer to heaven as it roasted pork to what he hoped would be perfection. The rich smell took him back home, to his farewell feast and the roasted beast that had been Rudolf's first kill. Oh, now that had been a feast! Could these foreigners match it? The crack of what sounded like a spitting cat forced his eyes open. No, it was just the beast's flesh spitting at the coals that roasted it, like its last act of courage before the old gods took it to Valhalla. Did pigs go to heaven though, he wondered. The men of the new faith said no, but he didn't know enough about the old to be sure. Hogs probably went up to the great feasting table in the sky, much like their bodies had here. Such was their fate, as this exile was his. At least he was not a pig, however much he roasted in his northern clothes. He headed away from the clamor, toward the cliffs. "Boy, boy," an imperious, elderly voice called. Rudolf turned. He'd learned the hard way not to ignore an old woman's commands. If he hadn't sat on that throne for a moment and Queen Regina hadn't caught him, then he wouldn't be here, exiled at the other end of the world. Better alive than dead though, and alive he could train more so that one day he could better serve his king. The man whose backside belonged on that cursed throne. If the approaching woman was Queen Regina, Rudolf would have run. As it was, he forced himself to hold his ground. The woman everyone called Nurse limped up to him. "Have you seen them? Wee devils they are. Their father insists they must attend the feast dressed in their best, and I cannot find them anywhere." The Lord Angus's daughters were missing? Rudolf's heart turned to ice as he remembered the day he'd lost his little sister to the ice on the fjords. But there was no ice here, and little water either, for the burns that had flowed only yesterday were little more than mud now after days without rain. It truly was a different world to Viken. If he had a choice, today he would be in the swimming hole the other boys had spoken of. A pool they said never dried up. A place deep enough for a little girl to drown. Panic gave his feet wings as he crested the rise, following the dried-up burn. If he could get there in time, perhaps he could save them. Perhaps. A shrill scream stopped his heart, but not his feet. Still he ran. If a girl could scream, she could breathe, and he could still save her. By all the saints in heaven, please let him save her. Low-hanging branches sliced at his face, but still Rudolf ran on until he almost fell over the lip of the pool, or what had been the pool. Perhaps even this morning it had still held water, but now it held 3 wriggling, shrieking girls as they played in liquid mud. Alive. Safe. All 3. Portia, Lena and Ali, so covered in mud he couldn't tell them apart, not that it was an easy matter anyway, given the girls looked identical. Rudolf's heart dared to beat again, and he took a deep breath. "Nurse," he shouted. "I have found your 3 little pigs." 2. You fought well today, and you have a knack for commanding men. I know several men owe you their lives after today, for it was your quick thinking in the heat of battle that saved them." Rudolph's chest puffed at Angus's praise. Angus continued, "You'll need new armor soon. You're not a boy anymore, and your shoulders are too wide for that breastplate." "Where there's gaps an arrow will find them," Angus said, throwing the reins of his horse to a groom. Rudolf did the same, but he lingered to stroke Hector's side as he was led off. He'd never owned a finer horse. Not back in Viken or since he arrived here. How many years had it been now? At least 6. Maybe 7. "You like him, don't you?" "See, I told Lewis he couldn't sell him off the islands. Valuable breeding stock he'll be when you're not riding him." Rudolf remembered his manners. "Thank you again, Lord Angus. He's a princely gift indeed." Angus waved away his thanks. "No more than you deserve. My own father gave me my first warhorse when I reached manhood. My first ride, the bastard reared up and threw me on my ass. My brother laughed himself sick. You have a much better seat than did at your age. Better than Portia, though better not tell her I said that." Rudolf laughed. "No, I won't, as long as you know that's what I'll be thinking about when I'm staring at her bottom next time we go riding. Man your age should be looking for a wife. I know I was. Or will your father be sending one from Viken?" Viken? Why would he send a girl after him? This was home. Rudolf would likely never see Viken again. "Viken girls choose their husbands just like the ones here," Rudolf managed to say. "I left no sweetheart behind me, so no girl will be coming to find me." An explosion of red blasted through the door to the longhouse. "There they are. I found them," Portia cried, tossing her hair off her face. She'd forgotten her shoes again, and with no nurse to remind her anymore, she'd probably been wearing holes in her stockings the whole time they'd been away. "I brought you a gift," Rudolf said, pulling the feather from under his breastplate. He'd kept it in the pocket over his heart. At the end of the battle, when those rank cowards were running away, a golden eagle circled the field and dropped it. Landed right at my feet. I thought you might like a new quill. Portia dashed up to him and plucked the feather from his hand. Then she threw her arms around him and hugged him. Rudolf laughed as he returned her hug, conscious of Angus's thoughtful eyes on him. Angus was planning something, to be sure. "Can we go riding now?" Portia demanded. The woman-child had all the impatience of a child, while her body grew more and more into a woman's form. Rudolf laughed again. "I have been riding all day, and Hector too. I am starving. I hope you have a good dinner ordered." Portia would not be put off. "Tomorrow then? If we leave early, we might be able to make it up to Loch Findlagan and search for its secret. While you were away, I went through Mother's things and found a scroll about the history of Isla. It said the Standing Stones." Angus interrupted. "Tomorrow, Rudolf needs to be measured for new armor. He's outgrown his." Portia laughed. "Must be all the food he eats. And people call me and my sisters pigs." This earned Rudolf a glare. Rudolf hung his head. The tale of him finding the 3 little sisters, wallowing in the mud like pigs, had spread rapidly through the Southern Isles, as all good stories did. Even if 7 years had passed since that day, Portia still had not forgiven him. She might never. He glanced at Angus. "I'm sure I won't be needed all day for new armor. There will be time for a ride tomorrow. Perhaps not to Loch Findlagan, but we can take the horses for a ride on the beach." Portia enveloped him in another hug, tighter and longer than the first. "I love you, Dolph." Rudolf patted her back awkwardly, his eyes offering an apology to Angus. Angus nodded, unconcerned. "Enough talk of tomorrow. I'm famished. I fancy a fine leg of mutton for dinner, and I'm sure Rudolf does too. Release your prisoner, Portia." He headed inside. Portia let go, then tucked her hand into Rudolph's. "I'll release you on one condition. You must tell me all about the battle over dinner. How many men you killed, whether you were close enough to hear their last words, or did you shoot them with your bow?" She was the same age as he'd been when he arrived on Isla, Rudolf realized, and just as bloodthirsty. "I did not use my bow this time. Angus had archers enough. I want my own bow. Viking women sometimes go to war with their men," you said. "I could be one of the archers and kill those cowardly, thieving Albans before they could step ashore." Rudolf laughed. "Are you strong enough to draw a bow yet?" Portia pouted. "No. When you are full-grown like me, you may practice with mine. If you can hit the target, I promise you I will see that you have your own bow." Her eyes lit with the fire that seemed to burn without cease within her. "Really?" Rudolf could refuse her nothing. He prayed that Angus would agree. "Really?" 3. Portia reacted to the king's demands the way she always did when something vexed her. She went shooting. Her bow was a comforting weight in her hand as she marched to the practice field. The smooth wood was exactly the right size for someone of her stature, as Rudolf must have known, for he'd given it to her on her last name day. Much easier to shoot with than his own monster bow, easily taller than he was. It had taken her years before she'd had the strength to fire anything from his bow, but when a lucky shot clipped the target, Rudolf had made good on his promise, a bow of her own and archery lessons to keep her from shooting him instead of the target. Not that she'd meant to do that. The arrow had accidentally gone through his boot, and she'd told him so. She wasn't sure he believed her though. She sighed and took aim. She emptied her quiver in record speed, wishing the plain wood target had a picture of the king's face painted on it. She did not even know what the bastard looked like. She imagined King Donald as old and fat with thinning hair, a petulant fool who demanded things that were not his, like the spoiled child he'd once been. She fitted an arrow to the bowstring. How dare he try to claim her lands? Her father's lands truly, but hers too, for she was his firstborn. She drew the arrow back. How dare he insist they pay him tribute? A man who had no right to their lands, or the fruit from it. She sighted along the arrow, blowing out her breath in a rush. How dare he call their people foreigners? How dare he? She released, and the arrow flew toward the target. It lodged in the side, so close to the edge that it only hung there for a moment before it fell to earth. Earth that sorry excuse for a king had no claim on. Portia stomped her foot for emphasis. Looking at the target, I wondered if Ali had picked up a bow for her annual archery practice. But Ali doesn't stamp her foot like that. Rudolf gestured at the target across the field. Are you feeling sorry for the target, Portia? Trying not to hit it because hitting it would be cruel? Portia's face turned as red as her hair. Trust Rudolf to bring that up. No one else remembered something that happened 10 years ago except him. I still think butchering pigs is cruel, but nothing I can say or do will stop it, for the rest of you will still eat it. So will I, and be properly thankful to the animal that gave its life so that we may eat its flesh. She sounded like the priest at last Sunday's Mass, and she knew it. Before Rudolf could tease her for that too, she continued, It won't matter if I miss my target anyway. Men all bunch up in an army, so if I miss one man, I'm bound to hit the one beside him. He laughed. Since when are you riding to war? Your father is not so short of men, he'll need you to fight. His gaze traveled from her feet up to her face. Unless you plan on wearing a man's garb. There's many a man on the island who's dreamed of seeing you without your gown, but I'm sure none of them imagined you'd be wearing armor. Just as her blush faded, it flamed into life once more. Only Rudolf could say these things with such brutal honesty, without apology. Not for the first time, she wondered if he'd been one of those dreaming men. Men who would soon be off to war with no time to dream of anyone, she told herself sternly. I have no need to ride to war. Raiders come in boats when they see fit, and if the menfolk are not at home, then it falls to us women to defend our homes. Rudolf inclined his head. So it does. Here in the south, right up to Viken in the north. But your father will never leave you here unprotected, and you will always have me. He drew a dagger from his belt and sent it flying toward the target. He hit the center. I will defend you with my life, Portia. That serious look in his eyes heated her all over again, but not just her face this time. There was something about Rudolf that lit a fire inside her. The kind of fire she liked but could never stoke. I'm sure my father will be very grateful for your service, she said sweetly. He opened his mouth but no words came out. Then he shook his head as if to rid it of ideas that had no place there, a feeling Portia understood well. Finally he said, but it would be lax of me to stop you from practicing when you so sorely need it. Why you, Portia began, then stopped as Rudolf grinned. When he smiled, the man was charming enough to coax a honeycomb from an angry bear. Not even she was immune to him. Perhaps that's why she felt so hot inside. Help me retrieve my arrows then. Rudolf pulled the lucky few from the target, while she hunted through the grass for the rest. When the quiver was more than half full once more, she marched back to where she'd left her bow. Rudolf with his longer strides got there first, lifting the weapon in readiness, though he didn't hand it to her. First I must check your stance, Portia, he said. Show me how you stand. Never one to like being ordered about, Portia set her hand on her hip and waved an arrow. You'd better hope I don't decide to make you my target instead. You wouldn't do that, he said easily. You like me. No matter how much he irritated her and make her feel other unwelcome feelings she had to ruthlessly suppress, Portia had to admit she did. Not aloud though. I might also like to see you hopping around with an arrow in your foot again. You have your dreams and I have mine. I like mine better. Now do you wish to practice or no? Portia relented and stepped up to the bow, angling herself so that she faced Rudolf and not the target. She fitted her arrow to the string. There. Good enough for you? Rudolf inspected her, even going as far as to march right the way around her before he nudged her foot with his. Your stance needs to be a little wider, pointed to where you wish the arrow to go. His arms came around her, lifting the bow so that the arrow no longer pointed at the ground. Portia wanted to relax into his embrace, and surrender to the promise of protection he offered. It would be so easy, and yet it was something she could never do. Rudolf was a foreigner, a ward sent from Viken to learn to fight in her father's house. One day he would be summoned home to fight for whatever Viken lord his family owed fealty to. Portia was her father's eldest daughter and heir to Isla. The man she married would follow her father as Lord of Isla, the largest and most powerful of the Southern Isles. She could never marry a mere household knight. It would take a lord at least, or a lord's son, to hold father's place in council. Rudolf knew this as well as she did, which was why he never took liberties, though he made it very clear he would like to. But that was an invitation she could never offer. She straightened, paying more attention to the bow and arrow than the boy whose breath tickled the back of her neck. Which foot do you like best, Dolph? She asked. Your left one, because that's pointed at the target, he said, cupping her elbow in his hand. Now draw sight along the arrow. His hand slammed into her gut, just below her breasts, forcing her to exhale. Now I've made you breathless, you may shoot. The arrow whistled across the field and thwacked into the target. Not in the center, marked by the divot from Rudolf's knife, but nearer than any of her earlier attempts. There. Rudolf inclined his head. Not bad. If you were aiming for a man's heart, you might have hit him in the throat. But we can improve on that. With infinite patience Portia knew she would never possess, Rudolf helped her empty her quiver, all into the target this time. Then he headed across the field with her to retrieve the arrows again. When the quiver was full, he held it out and asked, "Are you still angry, or have you done enough shooting for one day?" Until she hit the center of the target every time, it would not be enough. She sighed. A landless knight like Rudolf would not understand. "One more time," she said, reaching for the quiver. Rudolf caught her hand in his. "You're bleeding. I say you have done enough. We should get you inside, so one of your sisters can bandage these fingers. You can practice more on the morrow, but first I must get you some pig's ears." "Pig's ears are no use to anyone except the pig itself," Portia said, snatching her hand back. Her fingers tingled where he touched them, a hint of magic that called for more. She refused to yield. Isla would not yield. Rudolf chuckled. "Get you to your sisters. I'll return your things to the armory and find you inside." He shouldered both her quiver and her bow and headed across the yard. Portia sucked on her bleeding fingers as she headed inside. Ali would exclaim over the blood, fanning herself in case she fainted. Lena would be the one to clean and bandage her, like Nurse had taught her to before age and infirmity had called the old woman from this life. As it would one day call them all. But not yet, if Portia had any say in it. 4. The moment Ali spotted Rudolf, she cried, "Dolph will go to war to save us. Won't you, Dolph?" Portia hushed her. She might only be a few minutes older than her sisters, but sometimes the difference felt like years. "If you ladies need saving, I would be honored to be of service," Rudolf said as he approached. He met Portia's eyes without a hint of laughter and bowed low. "From what must I save you? Is there another spider?" Lena laughed. "No, only Portia screams at spiders. This time it's some pompous king demanding tribute from all the island lords which they will not pay." "That's no way to talk about your liege," Rudolf said mildly. "I've never heard anyone call King Harold pompous before." "That's because it's not him." Ali giggled. "It's some silly foreigner called Donald. He calls for tithes and men to combat what he calls our foreign invaders, so that he might help us make the Southern Isles great again." "Nay, he wants to make Alba great again, but he insists we are an important part of it," Lena corrected. Portia frowned. "Important enough to attract his interest, because he thinks we might offer him men or money. No king has ever offered us anything we didn't have to pay for. Not King Harold or this Donald. The lords of the Isles know this and they will refuse him, which will mean war. The lords are in the right of it. The Isles are under Harold's protection and they do not belong to some man called Donald. If he wants them, he will have to fight for them and pay dearly," Rudolf declared. Now Portia thought of it, he did sound like one of the lords. Somehow, over the years, Rudolf the boy had turned into a man, or at least something like one. A pity he would never be one of them. Because if he was, perhaps this Donald should just ask to marry Portia. We all know no man on the islands is good enough for her, for she turns her nose up at all of them. Would a king suit you, Portia? Ali teased. Rudolph's eyes were upon her, and Portia found she could not meet them. Father knows as well as I do that I can only wed a man who can hold the islands. Hold them and defend them like he has. All this Donald has done is blow wind at us, and the Isles have withstood greater gales than anything he's thrown at us thus far. I will wed when a strong enough man presents himself, and not before. See? Portia will never marry for love. Or she'd have picked Rudolf long ago, Lena declared with a smile. Ali dissolved in a fit of giggles, falling back to kick her legs in the air. Once again Portia felt far too hot. She rose and marched out of the room, the sound of her sister's laughter following her. And booted footsteps. Rudolf, of course. Portia, he began cautiously, as if wishing to warn her of his presence. She turned and held up her hand to halt him before he said any more. My sisters like to joke at my expense. And yours. I'm sorry if their levity sounds insulting to your ears. You are a strong and skilled warrior. Both my father and I know that. So do my sisters, I think. But when we hear whispered news of war, well, you see how we react. Lena will pick herbs to dry for every wound and ailment imaginable, and fill the cellars with all the food she can possibly preserve. Ali. She will make light of everything as she always does, for laughter is her way. And you shall shoot things because even if every man on this island dies in battle, you will still defend it while you have breath left in your body, Rudolf finished for her. Isla is your home and the Southern Isles are your kingdom as much as Harold holds Vicon or Donald does Alba. Now it was Portia's turn to laugh. No one understands me the way you do, Dolph. I swear it is as though you have some magical power to see into my head. I'm glad I didn't shoot you. Rudolf laughed with her. I'm glad you didn't shoot me either. If it comes to war, I hope I am never on the opposing side to you and your father. I meant it when I said I would protect you. He held out his hand. Here. Portia glanced down and recoiled. What in heaven's name do you intend to do with those? Give me your hand. Reluctantly, she did as he asked. He wrapped the pig's ear around her middle finger, the leather surprisingly warm and soft from being in his pocket. Next, he threaded a thin leather thong through the holes edging the ear until he'd laced it like one of her gowns. He pulled the whole thing taut, then tied it at the bottom. Now the others. Soon he'd shrouded all three of her middle fingers in pig's ears. The leather was paler than boot leather, as though the pig's ears were tanned differently. In fact, the pigskin was so close to the shade of her own skin that it looked like she wasn't wearing the finger guards at all. Next time, wear these when you need to shoot out your frustration. Your arms will tire long before you make your fingers bleed. Pig's ears are tough. Thank you, Dolph. Portia threw her arms around his neck. Too late, she realized as her body molded to his that she shouldn't do such things anymore. Though he cared for her as much as any brother, Rudolf was most certainly not one of her siblings. Awkwardly she peeled herself away from him, only now realizing that he held his arms stiffly at his sides. Stopping himself from returning her embrace, or pushing her away? Oh, she was so stupid. It's my pleasure, Portia, he said. With a slight bow, he left her. Portia sighed, only now realizing she held her well-wrapped fingers over her heart. If only she was as free as her sisters. But the world didn't work the way she wanted to, for life was nothing like a fairy tale.